Hello, ColdFront. Great. So, over the course of the last 2 days, almost 2 days now, we've heard a lot about accessibility and how people value privacy, and a lot of web performance mentioned. And that means we have a lot of things in common. And today I want to talk a little bit about how we can implement or use these things and how we can possibly, with that, build better products. And interestingly enough, usually when I come to places, I never share my name with anyone. So usually I have to always spell it and kind of explain it because it's a bit of an uncommon name. And 2 days ago, I actually heard that there's a common name sharer in Denmark. And this one apparently is sitting in the castle of Kronborg, just sitting there sleeping and waiting for the day where Denmark is going to get in trouble so he can wake up and save the world. Not me, for sure, so I'm very excited to paraphrase Phil again. Unfortunately, he just didn't mention it, but I'm very excited to be here. So while I'm originally from Germany, I've been based in Hong Kong for the past 10 years. And my name is Holger Bartel. I'm a designer and developer, and I run a small design consultancy where I work with various clients on web products and help them build websites and apps and all kinds of things. When you're working with clients, the problem with working with clients is there's always budget restrictions, and I'm sure everybody knows it's hardly the case where you're free of restrictions and can implement whatever you think is important, and you really sometimes think, oh, this thing is really important to me, and I would love to implement it, but then client goes budget, no, we can't do this. So at some point, I came up with the idea of okay, I want to work on things where I can implement or build things the way I want to, and build things in a way how I think various things are important to myself, or how I can benefit users in a more or in a closer way. So I met two friends of mine at a conference, and we had a chat, and we talked about doing things in a different way, how we wanted, and we decided to build a product together. And as Phil mentioned, we came together, we built a product called Colloq, which is a conference platform. And when we set out with very strong opinions on how we wanted to do things and what we wanted to do. And first of all, we wanted to build a better product. And we also wanted to see what we can do, what I just mentioned, how we can possibly benefit users and build things in a way that actually helps the user a little bit more. We also wanted to challenge the status quo of how digital products are built nowadays. And a lot of products are just okay, we click build it and out of the door, and then you're looking for the first exit. And we wanted to see if we can actually manage to build a sustainable product. And last but not least, we also wanted to put ethics at the core of everything we do. So when we're speaking about ethics or ethical design, and by referring to design, I'm not always referring to only pretty pixels and visuals, but rather design in a bigger picture. And if we look at the definition of ethics, we can see first of all, it's a guiding philosophy. It's a principle. And it's also the discipline of dealing with what is good and bad, and with moral duty and obligation. So in short, we can say ethical design is design created with the intent to do good. So now you might ask, isn't all design created with intent to do good? And while we might say, yeah, it could be possible, there's still some design, even with a good intent, can go wrong. Sometimes Facebook curates your most popular, most liked photo into these little neat galleries that you can then share with your friends and the whole world. And sometimes your most liked or most popular photo might actually not be connected with the best memories for yourself. So a lot of times we speak about technologies, tools, what frameworks and what libraries to use. But how much time do we actually spend thinking about the impact of our products? What's the long-term implications of what we're building, either on our users or even on society? Making the world a better place has become like one of those claims that like a lot of companies out there like easily use, like way too easy. But if you're putting like, with your disrupting product, like if you're putting 5 million people out of the job, are you actually really making the world a better place? Some design is also bad or evil, and then we have like big platforms and they collect a lot of data and collect and collect and collect. And at some point, usually they lose it. So there's like sometimes a lack of business model and product and their data, product and the user becomes like, no, the user becomes the product. And sometimes that's kind of like no business model, and then you might be taking part in surveillance capitalism. And the problem with surveillance capitalism is that like at some point in the future, you might be violating human rights, but even way, way, way before that, you could, and even unknowingly, put systems, or like when systems like make decisions about users, you could be using data against users. And I find this is like where we're crossing a certain line. We shouldn't do, or like we shouldn't limit like people's chances or opportunities just to make a profit. Then there are others, and they do use dark patterns to make a profit. And dark patterns are like little tricks on websites that like force users into making decisions or pressure them into like kind of doing things they don't want to. And there's a variety of dark patterns out there. And I'm sure like everyone has seen them. We've heard about them yesterday already a little bit in Vitaly's talk. And with all that variety of dark patterns, they have one thing in common. One example of such dark pattern is like this cancellation page of an online newspaper. And while the user has already made up their mind to cancel the subscription, the only two options they're left with is like, okay, you can either chat with customer care or call a sales representative. The problem with this is that like the sales representative's sole purpose is to persuade the user into not canceling their subscription. And I find this is like where something is fundamentally wrong. I would like to do a quick show of hands. How many of you like to go on holidays? All right, that's almost as expected. I see a few people, we need to have a chat later. But when I go on holidays, I usually, a lot of times, like to take it very spontaneous and only book the first night after arrival, and the first night after departure, and everything in between can be easily spontaneously winged these days. You go onto booking sites and you just start looking what you kind of have in mind. And you find all these like listings on all kinds of different booking sites. And after a short while, you already notice like there's like these little notices like, oh, 53 people have actually looked at this property. This one has been booked 24 times. It was 46 times in the last 24 hours. And I'm like, wow, this is a lucky owner. And you just go on, one room left, this has been booked 3 times, then there's like 2 listings alone, and you see like there's like 5 pressure triggers or dark patterns on there, which kind of suggest like, okay, you have to really make a choice now. This is a limited offer, it's only valid now, you can save now, and make up your mind, otherwise you might be missing out, and this makes me very uncomfortable. So there's a lot of talk about human-centered design, and I don't see where anything in that is like very human-centered. That's like clearly very business-centered. And in conversations about user experience, like a lot of times I hear like, okay, user journeys and wireframes and what color should this button be, and maybe the wording, but maybe. So a lot of times it evolves around these things. And I think we have to look at user experience in a much, much more holistic way, because there are like many, many more parts that are actually part of a great user experience. If you're building a product and you're not considering accessibility, then that product will only be so great, and that user experience will be only that great for some of us. We have as designers, we have a very, very big responsibility in what we're doing. And that responsibility kind of defines the relationship of our users and our product. And every one of us, when we're in a relationship, we also want to feel secure and safe and respected. And this is where security becomes an important part. I like to compare this with the good old mechanical hard drives. It was never a matter of if that drive is going to crash, but it was always the question, when is it actually going to happen? If we look at data breaches and the history of them, we can see even back in the days, 2014, we can see there's already data breaches happening. And if we then follow all the years up to today, we can see that data breaches have increased tremendously. Nowadays, it's a lot of them. And nowadays, 100 million data sets is almost not worth mentioning. And we probably all remember this slide and this guy where stuff just got out of control. So yeah, I thought that was a very good fit. So we really have to consider this as an important aspect of user experience nowadays. And again, we always talk about so much how can we collect more and more data and get all this user data to make something with it. But how much time do we actually spend thinking about how are we going to secure this data? How are we going to retain this data? And more importantly, I find is do we really need all this data, or does it just satisfy our egos? Simple rule to be on the safe side is the data that you don't have can't be lost, leaked, or stolen. Now we've talked about collecting data from users, but if we flip it around, there's also this part where we actually have to serve something to the users. And this brings me to the area of web performance. And there's this nice saying in the web performance community, which actually Phil has mentioned earlier, which is the best request is the request that doesn't have to be made. Nowadays, we don't have to travel to remote islands anymore to find out how bad an experience slow-loading pages can be. It's you can pretty much experience that anywhere, in front of everyone's doorstep. And we all know how annoying this is. And I want to tell you another story about holidays, because we all like that so much. So last year, I went to Cambodia. And instead of traveling from the north to the south with a car and spending a whole day driving, we decided okay, let's just take a flight and save pretty much a whole day. And I went on to various flight comparison sites to find a suitable option. And unfortunately, on none of these sites, I would make it through checkout. The connection was very, very spotty, and unlucky, I did not make it. Then I thought, okay, well, if that doesn't work, the airline website probably does help me. I went on to the local airline's website, made my choice, and all I got was a little bit of something and a nice example for a failed CSS download. And that was after 4.5 minutes of waiting. So after quite some time, I decided, okay, this is not going anywhere. I called a travel agent, booked my tickets, paid a premium, and 30 minutes later, I had them delivered to the hotel. So instead of relaxing by the pool, as promised, I was more like this. And I have no idea who ever thought that 8 megabytes of hero images on any page would be a good idea. So as a user in that relationship with a product, I do want to feel respected, and this is absolutely disrespectful. A nice example that I came across was in this app where I actually left as a very happy and respected user. It's like an app where you can scan the label of a wine bottle. It then like gives you ratings and comments and a little bit of explanation of the wine. And what happened, I tried to access it from like a very slow connection, and it went a little bit like this. You upload your picture, and then they try to analyze it. And at some point, they just said like, oh, you know what? We're very sorry, but we couldn't figure out what you want. You just go do your stuff, and we'll let you know once we're done. And I find this is a very, very good way of like, if you're slow, at least you can be nice and kind of respect your users. And in that case, happy users will always forgive and forget. So with all this said, how can we make use of this and like build better products, or try to build better products with like thinking about these things? And I think to do that, we kind of have to rethink the approach of how we're building things nowadays. We take a lot of things for granted, and sometimes I find we are lacking a little bit of creativity of like how to break out and like try new things. The internet is like still very, very young, and most of the time we're also experimenting. There was a time when there was like, well, we had frame sets once upon a time, and that was a bad idea. And then sometime after that, there was like DHTML, like dynamic HTML, and everybody thought like, oh wow, this is like cool stuff. Turned out it wasn't. Then Flash came along, and it was awesome sauce for many years. And then at some point we realized, well, maybe it's not the best way. So all these things are trials and error of like kind of conquering something new, and then experiments fail. Sometimes they go very well and they stick around. But I think we need those experiments also like to drive the web forward, and there's nothing wrong with it, because only by failing we will find out what we actually can make use of and like what lasts over a long time. And again, we take things for granted. So for example, we do have very, very advanced cars nowadays, and electric cars, and hey, awesome. And sometimes I find we forget how we actually got there. And I want to take you on a little tour through history and go back in time and see how we actually got to these beautiful cars. So this is Carl. And Carl was an engineer. And Carl Benz, good German fellow, he was actually acknowledged as the inventor of the first modern car. And in 1885, he came up with this original Benz patent motor wagon, which then 1 year later, he received the patent for it. And it's considered like the first practical automobile. Funnily enough, like during the first presentation of that car, it was a bit difficult to control, ran into a wall. Sounds a bit familiar. So from then on, let's travel 25 years in the future, and we will have Ford's Model T. So it more resembles a little bit of a car. 4 wheels, has a bit more space, 4 people can ride in it. And this is only like 25 years. So a few months ago, the internet turned 25 years old. And if we look at the timeline of this, from even Ford Model T, it was another 40 years until the seatbelt concept made it actually into cars. And from then on, it took another 20 years for the first seatbelt law to be passed in Australia. So now we do talk about like electric cars, and we're talking about self-driving cars, but somehow I keep thinking maybe like in terms of evolution, the internet might be more like somewhere here. So it's very, very early days. And if we want to kind of shape this direction and bring it into more like a sustainable future, maybe we have to reconsider and like think about like the things we do and how we do things. And the beauty of the web is it's for everyone, it's very open, and everybody can contribute and be part of shaping that directions. And like part of our job is to also help shape this direction. It's been like now roughly 18 years of usable CSS, and hey, we have finally learned how to center things. That's and with like Flexbox and CSS Grid, we also have a nice like layout system. So we know how to build things, like we can build things. And I think it's about time like we shift a little bit of our thinking towards people, because this is something we haven't really acknowledged for quite some time. So I've been thinking about this for some time and came up with this like concept or idea that I want to share with you, which I call like the fundamentals for a future web, where we have to kind of like reconsider and think about things a little bit differently. So nowadays we have web standards, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a few other things. And web standards is like the default go-to now. It's like out of question that this is how we do things. But don't be mistaken, because there was a time where web standards weren't like as accepted or like the default as we think now. Like there was like a long, long struggle, and it only caught up, I don't know, maybe like in the last 10 years a bit. And now it's like the absolute unquestioned default. But one thing that we've never really thought about like incorporating is like, what about our moral standards? What do we actually do for people to have like a better experience, instead of like only think about technology and how we can build things in a better way? So I think one of the things we should like always think about is like privacy. Privacy by design. We should always protect our users' privacy and kind of like make that part of this whole development process and design process, where we just like acknowledge this is an important part. We need to be responsible, because we always say like, oh, the web is for everyone, but then once we're not considering accessibility, it's actually not for everyone anymore. So I think this is an important factor. Like we should build responsibly and build experiences that allow everyone to be part of it. And the same as we've seen just now with the security breaches, I think the same is true for security, because it's an important part. It's becoming less or like more and more out of control, and we need to find a way of how to mitigate that in the future, because if that's like growing this way, we'll have like 100 data breaches at some point every day. So I think this should be like the set, or at least the idea of a set of our like web fundamentals, where we should not only think about like technology, but also think about like what can we do on the side of moral standards, and how can we actually benefit our users. So now a lot of people will go like, yeah, no, that's too much work. We spend so much time on setting up tooling and maintaining tooling, and I think most of the time goes into like fixing broken tooling, but there is like so many things to do. And a lot of people will go like, accessibility, nah. We don't actually have a budget for accessibility, and by the way, we don't have those users. We don't need it. And the same goes for web performance. It's been like a normal occurrence with clients where like, web performance, nah, that's not important for us. Like all our users are in the US or some big cities, like we have no need to optimize for web performance. Whereas like now, this is like slowly shifting, and I'm very glad it is, but it's an important factor. Usually it's like the eye candy that pays the bills, and I've never heard anyone say like, CSS, no, let's not do that, it's too much work. So this is like where I want to come back to Colloq and how we build things, and I want to share a few of the ideas with you, like what was important to us and what benefits did we take away from this, and just to give you a little bit of like an inspiration and motivation, maybe like to think about things from a different angle. I think one of the main questions asked is, you as a user, how would you like to be treated? And as product owners or company owners, we have to think about, what are we willing to give? What are we willing to do for a better user experience? Because like there's always a give and take, and we cannot just be there and like kind of collect and collect and take, and like in return we're not doing much. So when we started out building that platform, we were like, okay, important things for us. Like we wanted to build an accessible and inclusive platform, an experience. And while nothing is ever perfect, we took a lot of the things really to heart and started like building accessibility in from the ground up, and wanted to like allow for nice voiceover readouts, and like we have rebuilt components just like because we didn't like the way they were read out with voiceover. We have also built everything progressively enhanced because we thought like, okay, we have the responsibility to make things work in a good way. So everything is progressive enhanced, and this has like huge benefits. And I want to share one story with you that's actually quite funny, and it brings me also to another thing we've seen yesterday. Harry has actually talked about it, and it's like, how well does your JavaScript fail? And the fun story is, like the other day, we managed to actually deploy like an error in our JavaScript file, which brought the whole JavaScript to a halt. And that was on a Friday, and took us like almost a day to even find out about it because like nobody complained, everything just kept working. And then we found out on a Friday evening, and we were like, okay, you know what? Actually, it's perfectly fine because everything works. It just works a little bit differently, but we don't have to stress out. So let's just enjoy our weekend and fix it on Monday. And this is a great benefit because like if you really like dependent on your JavaScript, that Friday night would have turned like into a not so fun evening. We also set out and wanted to build like a 100% tracking-free experience. And for us, that meant like absolutely no tracking and no analytics, no third parties. We're not even sharing like any cookie with any external party. And while that, I realize, is on the very, very extreme side, it was for us more like a way of like trying, like how can we actually try and take this whole like to the extreme and then learn from there and maybe add stuff on. And as I said with the data, like a lot of people like collect so much data, but do we really need it? And we thought like, okay, we just take the approach of like growing with our growth. Like once we really require or really need some metrics or some other data that we don't have, we can always add that on. But it puts us on the very safe side. And another benefit that we took away from that was when GDPR came along, we almost didn't have to worry about anything because everything was more or less compliant already, and we didn't have to mention a lot of third parties. We're only using like one for payment gateway, and everything else like we've built either from scratch. There's hardly any third-party libraries except for a little bit of tooling, of course. But it has a lot of benefits. And again, Harry mentioned that yesterday, and we've seen that like super, super long page with like, I don't know, 100 million requests for third parties. So doing it this way has like huge performance benefits because requests are very little, and we have also full control over everything. So no security issues from third parties, and so on and so on. So this is a very, very good way of implementing a very user-friendly, privacy-friendly, security-friendly product, and in turn, like you also as an owner, like get like really nice benefits. Then we came across this great tool, Have I Been Pawned? I'm sure many of you have heard of it by now. It's like Troy Hunt built this, and what it does, he collects all the data from security breaches, puts them in this database, and you can even go on this page and like check for your email and see in how many breaches you've been involved with your accounts. But what it does, like basically now there's an API, but we downloaded all the data and we added it ourselves. And when users sign up for an account, we run the hash of the password against the, I think 3.5 or 5.5 million hashes, and once we find a match, we ask our users to select another password, which kind of has also the advantage of we don't have any user accounts with like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 passwords, which in turn also is good for platform owners. Then there's like a lot of other things, like our server setup is quite complex and secure. We have like CSP headers, we're honoring do not track requests, and all of these little things. So that is great, awesome, good stuff, but we can't do this. Again, it's too much work. But there shouldn't be any but. I think we owe it to ourselves to make the web better and to create better experiences. And especially with like AI coming along, we need to get our values right. We need to get this kind of like moral mindset into our daily workflows, because we have like built or we don't want to run into like a disaster that we have built ourselves, because I mean, we're already doing that elsewhere, and we need to consider this. So by thinking about our users in a better way, we can like actually achieve better performance, better privacy, and we can offer better security. And most of all, or most important of all, I think we can become better designers and better developers and better product managers and better company owners and become better at our craft. And this is the reason why we're all here, because we want to become better at what we do. And there's not much magic involved. Like, greed doesn't have a moral compass, but every single one of you does. And all we have to do is like follow that and kind of incorporate that into our work. Well, that's like a lot of stuff to take in and like a lot of stuff to do, but we can start with like small things and implement and improve experiences, and then we just go from there and like continue. So from today on, I would actually like every single one of you to design with the intent to do good. And if you're not quite sure on how to do this or where to start, just start by designing with the intent to do better. And from then on, it's a very, very simple, straightforward process, because you just need to do better every single day. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Holger. Do you want to come and take a seat on the rocking chairs?
Actually, I wanted to sit out on that earlier, but I didn't.
Yeah. Great. So, there's so many things that, again, strike a chord with me there. And also, finally, I mean, it's taken until, 3 o'clock on day 2 until someone mentions DHTML. At long last, us. Hello, old friends. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it says a lot about age, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. We're showing our age a little bit. So, I mean, one thing that really strikes me there when you talk about, we can't afford to do this, that I feel like I heard that a lot when I was working at an agency, working with different clients. It almost felt like some of these things you're talking about become like a line item in a project plan. Yeah. And it's like you said, you wouldn't say, we don't have time for CSS, or we haven't got time should we pay for spell checking what we're doing? You wouldn't talk about that. But somehow things like accessibility and some of these good practices feel like an add-on. Are there ways to try and embed that better thinking and that better kind of philosophy in a project, rather than saying, we'll do it at the end? So, I mean, how do you try and imbue those values on a team and on a client? Have you had any success with that? Because I think it's such a hard challenge.
I think it's probably like the most important thing is like to create awareness, and pretty much that's also why I'm here and like talk about it, because I think that's like where it all starts. I mean, web performance, we've been talking about that since 2012, and now it's like considered like as an important part of like building stuff, so, right? Because we know there's like also a value to it, and I think not everything needs to have a value, but in the long term, and as I said, like I think we're very early days with a lot of things, so in the long term it will pay off. How do you get that done? I think a lot of times for the work I've done, many times I believed in certain things to be important. I didn't even discuss it with the client.
Right.
So you just do it. And yeah, if you run your own company, you can do that kind of, because it's always like a mixed balance.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times you don't even need to mention certain things, because you can just do it,
right?
Yeah. And I think it starts with a mindset. What's important to you? And then even if you start with, like, as I said, like the little things, you try to get those in there. So you sneak them in there. Yeah. And once they're in, maybe you can later rectify it. Oh, hey, we did this, by the way, and this is what you got from it.
Yeah. Hopefully, if the project works in the way that you'd hope it would, then ideally you get to the point that you can start demonstrating the benefits of it, rather than like debating whether you should do it in the first place.
And that's also a very important point, I think, like to kind of try to explain what are the benefits, like what's the business case. And where did I say that? In Sydney, someone was giving a talk making the business case for a design system. Yeah. And that was like very great, because it had like clear instructions in there where, okay, hey, if you do this, then this. So I think like that would be the next thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And yeah, it feels like it shouldn't be something that's explicitly expressed that, oh, by the way, we're going to do this the right way. You know, it should be kind of, you know, implicit in the approach.
It shouldn't be needed to actually mention.
Right, yeah.
It's like kind of, we're using web standards, we validate. It's like, yeah, you don't talk about it anymore.
Yeah,
Whereas like there was a time where you did have to argue about that. So
it's true, yeah. I think it should be like the baseline. Sadly, though, often, you know, we're not in a position that we have full control over these things. I think this shouldn't become just a therapy session for me talking about my experiences, but certainly, you know, I think many people here would struggle to disagree with the principles and the values you've been expressing, but I also know that often it's not, you know, we look at some examples and we say, oh, this has been poorly implemented or poorly designed, and often the developers and the designers working on that have the same kind of values as we do, but they're in this really difficult environment where, you know, they've had all of these other constraints and pressures and what have you. I know that I've been guilty myself of pointing at things and say, oh, that's really badly done, and then discovered that, you know, I've been standing in front of a developer who worked on it, who's taken me to task and quite rightly said, do you know all of these things that's a problem? So seems to be no question in sight here, does there? But I guess my question really is there a way that you can help defend the client from themselves? You know, because often they don't know what they need. They know what they want, but it's almost like you need to educate the stakeholders there so that the developers who share our values can do the same thing. Are there ways we can do that?
I mean, yes, there are.
Please solve the problem I've had for 20 years.
Exactly.
Was my question.
No, I think it's hard. I mean, there's like so many times where
It's
I
hard,
want to
isn't
say
it?
that, but like our clients always come up and like try to explain me how things work, and I'm like, we're not speaking on the same level. There's like no way you can explain me stuff, you know. But it's kind of that notion that everybody thinks they know the internet. So I think it's kind of like part of our job. I think the bigger part of our job is to educate people, and a lot of times like a business case is the easiest way because
you can demonstrate like a tangible value.
There's like
That's what I really like the example that I think Harry was showing in his talks, where he was showing what the site was like one way, and then emulating it with like all of the third-party things. Because when you can do a comparison of like before and after, it feels like there's a tangible difference. Right?
It's a bit hard to do for the moral stuff because like the.
but I guess accessibility. Is one of those things that people think they don't. I think you used the expression, you know, we don't have those kind of users. But of course, you know, it's a spectrum, right? And so, good accessibility practices, they impact everyone, right? So,
again, I think it's about education. I mean, how long? I mean, accessibility has been a topic like 15 years ago, and now it's picking up. Because enough people talk about it, enough people like consider it as an important. Not asset, but like part of the experience.
Right.
So I think we need to do the same for all the other things, and at some point, it will hopefully stick.
That sounds
an
good
answer?
to me. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I think that's a lovely sentiment as well. So I think we ought to wrap it up. But Holger, thanks so much for an informative talk. Your appreciation, please, for Holger Bartel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holger.